The Arizona desert spread like a copper sea at sunset, vast and merciless. Much like the winding road they traveled, Elena Vasquez clutched the steering wheel of her ancient blue Chevy pickup, knuckles white with exhaustion as the "now leaving Copper Springs" sign vanished in her rearview mirror. This was the fifth town in 3 years. Fifth town, fifth failure. Fifth time, whispering to her twin sons that tomorrow would bring something better. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mama, he's making that noise again. 6-year-old Miguel's voice drifted from the back seat where he sat beside his identical brother Lucas. Between them, nestled in a faded red bandana, a scruffy rooster with one eye and ruffled black feathers shifted restlessly. "Hush, Lazarus," Elena murmured, eyes flicking to the mirror. The boys had named the rooster after finding him half dead behind their last apartment. Saving him had been their project, their distraction from another hasty departure. We're almost there. The truth was, Elena had no idea if Willow Creek Ranch would be their salvation or just another temporary shelter. The Craigslist ad had been sparse. Asterisk ranch hand needed. Experience with horses preferred. Housing included for right candidate. Asterisk. But it was all she had left. Her savings had dwindled to 3 digits, and summer in Arizona waited for no one, especially those without reliable air conditioning. As the truck rounded a bend in the road, the valley opened before them like an unexpected gift. Golden fields stretched toward purple mountains. A weathered barn standing proud beside a low-slung ranch house painted the color of terracotta. A handful of horses grazed in the distance, their coats catching the dying light like burnished metal. "Horses!" Lucas pressed his face against the window, warm breath fogging the glass. "Mama, look!" The truck's tires crunched on gravel as they pulled into a long driveway. A hand-carved wooden sign read, "Willow Creek Ranch," in letters burned into the wood. Elena cut the engine, and the sudden silence felt weighted with both possibility and dread. "Stay in the truck, okay? I'll just—" But the twins were already tumbling out, legs dusty and eager after hours of confinement. Lazarus squawked indignantly from his bandana nest as Miguel carefully lifted him. "Careful with him," Elena called, gathering her courage before stepping out. The air smelled of sage and dust and something else. Something like potential. The evening breeze carried distant sounds of horses nickering and a windmill creaking somewhere out of sight. Elena closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself one moment of hope before reality inevitably intruded. "You lost?" The voice startled her. Deep and rough like stones tumbling down a dry riverbed. It belonged to a man emerging from the shadows of the barn. Tall and lean, dressed in worn jeans and a sun-faded shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and marked with an intricate sleeve of tattoos that disappeared beneath his shirt. His face remained partially hidden beneath the brim of a weathered Stetson, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze assessing her, the boys, the rooster. "I'm Elena Vasquez," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I called about the ranch hand position." The man said nothing for a moment, just studied her with eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. Then he removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and a face that might have been carved from the surrounding landscape, all angles and lines etched by sun and time. "Carson Wade," he said finally, offering a calloused hand. "Owner." His handshake was brief but firm, as if he measured his interactions with precise economy. "And those would be—" He nodded toward the twins, who were showing Lazarus the horses from a safe distance. "My sons, Miguel and Lucas. They're 6. Elena watched his expression carefully, waiting for the familiar shadow of reservation to cross his features. Single mother with 2 young children rarely topped anyone's hiring list. Something flickered in Carson's eyes. Hesitation, calculation. He glanced at the truck with its dented fender and mismatched driver's side door. "Ad didn't say anything about kids," he said flatly. "Or livestock." He eyed Lazarus, who chose that moment to ruffle his feathers importantly. Elena felt her stomach drop. Always the same story. Single mother with twins equaled complication. "We're a package deal," she said, straightening her spine. "The boys are well behaved, and Lazarus, well, he's just temporary until his wing heals completely. They won't interfere with my work." Carson's gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for something. Then his attention shifted to the boys, who had wandered closer to the corral where a chestnut mare had approached, ears pricked with curiosity. "That's Ember," Carson said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "She doesn't usually take to strangers." They watched as the mare stretched her neck over the fence, nostrils flaring as she investigated the twins. Miguel and Lucas stood perfectly still, their identical faces mirrors of wonder. "They've always been good with animals," Elena said quietly. "Their father had a way with them too." Carson nodded once, absorbing this information without comment. Then he looked back at her truck, the small duffel bags visible through the window, the obvious signs of a life condensed to essentials. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Place isn't fancy," he said abruptly. "Guest cabin behind the main house has been empty since my father passed. Needs work, but it's got running water and electricity." Elena blinked, unprepared for acceptance. "Just like that?" Carson shrugged one shoulder, his face unreadable. "Got 8 horses that need daily attention, garden that's overrun, fences that need mending. Been trying to do it all myself since my ranch hand left 6 months ago." He paused, glancing at the darkening sky. Can't do it alone anymore. The simple admission seemed to cost him something. Elena recognized the look of someone unused to acknowledging limitations. "When can I start?" she asked, relief making her lightheaded. "Tomorrow's soon enough." Carson turned toward the main house, then stopped. "There's stew on the stove. Enough for 4. His eyes flicked to Lazarus. "That thing stays outside." It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but as Elena called the boys to get their bags from the truck, she felt something unfurl in her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its cautious cousin. The guest cabin was exactly as Carson had described. Modest but solid. 1 bedroom with a double bed that would fit Elena and the twins, a small living area with a worn sofa, a kitchenette with the basics, and a bathroom with a shower that ran hot water, which felt like unimaginable luxury after weeks of motel rooms with lukewarm water at best. "Can we go see the horses tomorrow, Mama?" Lucas asked as she helped them wash the road dust from their hands and faces before dinner. "We'll see," Elena said cautiously. "Remember, this is Mr. Wade's ranch, and we need to respect his rules. This is a job for me, not a playground for you." "But he seems nice," Miguel insisted, always the more optimistic of the two. Elena thought of Carson's guarded expression, the way he measured his words like precious resources. "He seems fair," she amended. "And that's enough for now." Dinner was a quiet affair. Carson ate methodically, answering the boys' eager questions about the horses with brief but patient responses. Elena noticed how he watched her sons, not with suspicion or annoyance, but with a kind of puzzled curiosity, as if children were a species he hadn't encountered up close before. "Do you have kids?" Lucas asked with a child's directness, and Elena nearly choked on her stew. "Lucas, that's not—" "No," Carson answered simply, without elaboration. Something in his tone discouraged further questions on the subject. As they finished eating, Lazarus let out a strangled crow from outside where they'd left him in a makeshift coop Carson had pointed out. Once used for chickens years ago, he'd explained. "He only does that when he's settling in somewhere new," Miguel explained seriously to Carson. "He's saying this is home now." Carson's expression remained neutral, but something softened around his eyes. "We'll see," he said, echoing Elena's earlier words. "If he crows twice, maybe it's meant to be." He said it casually, almost absently, as if offering a small concession to a child's fantasy. Later, after the boys had fallen asleep in the double bed, their small bodies curled toward each other as they had since the womb, Elena sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the desert night unfold. Stars emerged in the vast sky, brilliant without city lights to dim them. In the distance, coyotes called to each other, their voices rising and falling like questions seeking answers. Carson's ranch spread before her, silver-washed in moonlight. Different from the places they'd fled before, trailer parks and apartment complexes, and once, briefly, her cousin's crowded house in Tucson. This place felt separate from the world somehow, as if it operated on different rules. A movement caught her eye, Carson walking from the barn to his house, his stride long and measured. He paused when he spotted her on the porch, then changed course and approached the cabin. Elena tensed slightly, wondering if he'd already reconsidered his decision. "Boys asleep?" he asked, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. Elena nodded. They crash hard after traveling. Carson glanced toward the window where soft snores drifted out. They look exactly alike. Identical, Elena confirmed. Miguel has a small birthmark on his wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. That's the only visible difference. Carson nodded, absorbing this information. Then, as if making a decision, he sat on the bottom step, leaving space between them. "Why a ranch?" he asked. Plenty of easier jobs for a woman alone with kids. The question wasn't asked unkindly, but Elena still felt defensive. "I grew up on a small farm in New Mexico. My father raised quarter horses. I know how to work, Mr. Wade." "Carson," he corrected quietly. "And I didn't mean it like that. Just curious what brings someone to answer an ad for an isolated ranch 40 miles from the nearest town." Elena considered how much to reveal. "We needed a fresh start," she said finally. "Somewhere quiet." Carson studied her face in the moonlight, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could read more than she intended to share. "Running from something," he observed. "Not a question." Elena stiffened. "We should get some rest. Early start tomorrow, right?" Carson didn't move immediately. 40 miles is a long way to come looking for someone," he said finally, standing. "Just so you know." The words hung between them. Not quite a promise of protection, but something adjacent to it. Before Elena could respond, he was walking away, his figure gradually dissolving into the darkness. That night, Elena dreamed of roads that never ended and towns that disappeared in her rearview mirror. She woke before dawn, disoriented by the unfamiliar silence. No traffic, no neighbors, no city sounds. Just the desert breathing around them and her son's soft exhalations beside her. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the boys, and made her way to the small kitchen. Carson had stocked the basics: coffee, eggs, bread, milk. Simple provisions that felt like extravagance after weeks of scarcity. As the coffee brewed, Elena stepped outside to check on Lazarus. The rooster greeted her with a soft cluck, his one good eye regarding her knowingly. "Just for now," she told him, refreshing his water. "Until we figure out what's next. Most people talk to other people, not roosters." Elena jumped, nearly dropping the water dish. Carson stood a few yards away, 2 mugs in his hands, steam rising in the cool morning air. "You move like a ghost," she accused, heart racing. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. Force of habit. He extended one of the mugs toward her. "Figured you might need this before we start." Elena accepted the coffee with murmured thanks, surprised by the gesture. Carson didn't seem the type for small courtesies. "Boys still sleeping?" he asked, glancing toward the cabin. Elena nodded. "They'll be up soon. They're good at entertaining themselves, but I'll need to set some boundaries about where they can and can't go." "Main rule is they stay away from the south paddock," Carson said. "Got a new stallion there, still settling in. Unpredictable." He sipped his coffee, gaze drifting toward the distant mountains. "Rest of the place is safe enough if they use common sense. No climbing fences, no sudden movements around the horses." "They know how to behave around animals," Elena assured him. Carson studied her over the rim of his mug. "Their father teach them that, the one good with animals." The question caught her off guard. "No," she said after a moment. "He wasn't around long enough for that." Something like understanding flickered in Carson's eyes, but he didn't press further. Instead, he outlined her duties: feeding and grooming the horses, mucking stalls, helping with the vegetable garden that had been his mother's pride, general maintenance around the property. The work would be physical and demanding, but the isolation was what Elena had been seeking. a place where they could disappear for a while. By mid-morning, the twins were awake and exploring their new surroundings under Elena's watchful eye. Carson showed her the tack room, the feed storage, the daily routine for each horse. He was a patient teacher despite his economy of words, demonstrating rather than explaining whenever possible. "You handle them well?" he observed, as Elena easily calmed an agitated mare. "Your father teach you that?" Elena nodded, brushing the mare's neck with long, steady strokes. "Papa believed horses could read intention better than any person. Said they know when your outside doesn't match your inside." Carson's expression suggested agreement, though he said nothing. He moved with natural authority around the animals, his body language fluid and confident. Elena found herself studying his methods, the small adjustments he made with each different horse. By late afternoon, sweat soaked Elena's shirt and her muscles ached from unaccustomed labor, but satisfaction hummed through her veins. This was honest work, work she understood. The twins had spent the day alternatively helping with small tasks and playing in the shade of a large cottonwood tree near the cabin, occasionally checking on Lazarus, who seemed to be adapting to his new surroundings with dignified acceptance. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the ranch, Carson approached where Elena was repairing a section of fence. "That'll hold," he said, inspecting her work with an approving nod. "You've done this before." "Told you I grew up on a farm," Elena replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm. "Boys did good today," Carson said unexpectedly. "Quiet. Helpful." Elena glanced to where Miguel and Lucas were carefully carrying small buckets of water to refresh the horses' troughs, their faces serious with concentration. "They're good kids," she said softly. "They've had to grow up fast." Carson's eyes met hers, a question in them that he didn't voice. Instead, he said, "Dinner at 7. They like hamburgers?" The casual invitation surprised her. "You don't have to feed us every night." "Easier to cook for 4 than 1, Carson said with a shrug. "Besides, been eating my own cooking too long. It's nothing special." As Elena opened her mouth to respond, a distinct crow pierced the evening air. Lazarus, standing atop the fence of his temporary home, puffed his chest importantly, before letting out a second, more emphatic crow. Carson and Elena both turned toward the sound. The rooster regarded them with his one good eye, then hopped down as if satisfied with his announcement. "Well," Carson said after a moment, his voice holding something Elena couldn't quite identify. "He crowed twice." He met her gaze steadily. "Guess you're meant to stay." The simple words carried a weight that belied their casualness. Elena felt something shift between them. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of its foundation. In the golden light of approaching sunset, with her son's laughter drifting across the yard and the vast Arizona sky opening above them, Elena allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. "Guess we are," she agreed quietly, and was rewarded with the first real smile she'd seen from Carson Wade. Brief and rusty from disuse, but genuine. That night, as crickets sang their ancient songs outside the cabin window and her sons slept peacefully beside her, Elena stared at the unfamiliar ceiling and wondered about the man whose land they now occupied. Carson Wade was a mystery wrapped in silence and careful distance, but she'd glimpsed something beneath his reserved exterior. Something wounded but not broken, something that recognized its counterpart in her. They were strangers sharing space, employer and employee, nothing more. But, as Elena drifted towards sleep, Lazarus's double crow echoed in her memory like a promise, or perhaps a warning. Only time would tell which it would prove to be. Days melted into weeks at Willow Creek Ranch, finding their rhythm like a river carving its path through desert stone. Elena's mornings began before dawn, the Arizona sun still just a promise on the eastern horizon. Carson was always awake first, a silhouette against the gradually lightening sky, as he made his silent rounds of the property. They shared coffee in the comfortable quiet of early morning, a ritual that required no words. The work was hard, but satisfying. Elena's hands grew calloused, her skin bronzed by the relentless sun. Each evening she collapsed into bed with the bone-deep exhaustion that, came from physical labor, yet she slept better than she had in years. No nightmares, no startling awake at every small sound. Just deep, dreamless rest. The twins thrived in the open space of the ranch. Their city-pale skin darkened to a rich olive, their identical faces always dusty by midday. Carson had been true to his word about boundaries, but he'd also, without fanfare, cleared a small area behind the cabin where the boys could dig and build and create their own small world. One morning, Elena discovered a set of child-sized tools beside the regular ones in the tool shed. "Found them in the attic," Carson explained when she asked, his tone dismissive. "No use gathering dust up there." But Elena had seen the careful way the old tools had been cleaned and repaired, handles sanded smooth to prevent splinters in small hands. Another small kindness that Carson offered without acknowledgement. "Mama, look what Mr. Carson showed us." Miguel called one afternoon as Elena finished her work in the stables. The twins came running, something cupped carefully in Lucas's hands. "Gentle," she warned automatically, kneeling to their level. Lucas opened his palms to reveal a tiny horned lizard, its spiny body perfectly still except for the rapid pulse visible in its throat. "It's a horny toad," Miguel explained with the seriousness of newly acquired knowledge. "Mr. Carson says they're special to the desert. They shoot blood from their eyes to scare predators." Elena looked up to find Carson watching from a distance, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod before turning back to his work on the corral fence. "Did he also tell you we need to let it go where you found it?" Elena asked. Lucas nodded solemnly. "He said we can observe but not keep. All wild things need their freedom." Something about the phrasing made Elena wonder if Carson had been talking about more than just desert creatures. That evening, as the twins helped Elena prepare a simple dinner in their cabin, a knock at the door surprised them. Carson stood on the porch, a burlap sack in his hands, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Thought you might want these," he said, holding out the sack. "Found a wild strawberry patch up in the hills. Boys might like them." Elena accepted the gift, touched by the thoughtfulness. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" "Nothing fancy. Just enchiladas." Carson hesitated, his eyes flickering past her to where the twins were setting the small table. Their movements synchronized without conscious thought, as they often were. "Got things to finish." He declined, already backing away. Then, as if making a decision that cost him something, he added, "But if you want, bring the boys up to the main house tomorrow night. Got something they might enjoy seeing." Before Elena could ask what he meant, Carson was striding back toward his house, his long legs carrying him quickly across the yard. "Why doesn't Mr. Carson smile much?" Lucas asked later as they ate the sweet wild strawberries for dessert. Elena considered how to answer. "Some people carry sadness with them," she said finally. "Like a heavy backpack they can't put down." Miguel frowned thoughtfully. "Like how you were sad after we left San Diego." Elena's breath caught. She hadn't realized they'd noticed how broken she'd been in those early days of running. "Something like that," she said softly. "Maybe he just needs friends," Lucas suggested with a child's simple wisdom. "Everyone's happier with friends." The next evening, Elena and the twins made their way to the main house as invited. Unlike their cabin, which was simple but welcoming, Carson's house felt like a museum of someone else's life. Family photographs lined the walls. An older couple Elena assumed were his parents, a younger Carson in military uniform, a group of men in desert camouflage with arms slung around each other's shoulders. But the most recent photo appeared to be at least a decade old, as if life had simply stopped being recorded at some point. Carson met them on the back porch, which overlooked a small canyon that caught the evening light in spectacular fashion. "Right on time," he said, nodding toward the western sky where the sun was beginning its dramatic descent. "Time for what?" Miguel asked, practically bouncing with curiosity. Carson pointed to a gnarled mesquite tree about 50 yards from the house. "Watch." As the light faded, Elena gasped softly. Tiny pinpricks of light began to appear around the tree, then more and more until the entire area seemed to be filled with floating sparks. "Fireflies!" Lucas exclaimed. "Lightning bugs," Carson corrected gently. Only place on the property they appear. My mother used to say it was because that tree has the oldest soul in the valley. The twins were entranced, their faces illuminated by wonder. Carson produced 2 small mason jars with holes punched in the lids. If you're careful, you can catch a few to look at, he told them. But we always release them before we go inside. Deal! Deal! The boys chorused, accepting the jars reverently. As the twins darted toward the magical tree, Elena turned to Carson. This is incredibly kind of you, he shrugged, uncomfortable with the acknowledgement. Kids should have some magic. After a pause, he added more quietly, didn't have much myself growing up. Something in his tone invited questions, but Elena knew better than to press. Instead, she asked, "Were you in the military? I noticed the photos." Carson nodded once. Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Is that where you learned to move so quietly? A ghost of a smile touched his lips, among other things. They stood in companionable silence, watching the twins chase lightning bugs, their delighted laughter carrying across the darkening land. Your boys, Carson said suddenly. They have a father somewhere? The question caught Elena off guard. Biologically, yes, she answered carefully. In every way that matters, no. Carson's eyes remained on the twins. He know where you are? Understanding dawned. Is that why you asked if I was running? You thought I'd taken them from their father? Not my business, Carson said, but his posture suggested otherwise. Their father's name is Daniel Reyes, Elena said, deciding that Carson deserved some truth in exchange for his kindness. He was a wildland firefighter I met when his crew came through my hometown. Charming, brave, completely unsuited to fatherhood. When I told him I was pregnant, with twins no less, he looked like I'd sentenced him to death. He left, Carson surmised. He sends birthday cards, sometimes Christmas money. Called once when they were 3, completely drunk, talking about how he wasn't built for domesticity. Elena's voice held old pain but no bitterness. The boys don't remember him. Carson was silent for a long moment. His loss, he said finally, the simple words carrying more weight than elaborate sympathy. Before Elena could respond, the twins came running back, jars glowing with captured lightning bugs. Look, Mama, they're like tiny stars. The evening concluded with Carson surprising them again, this time with homemade ice cream churned in an old-fashioned hand-cranked machine that had been his grandmother's. The twins took turns helping turn the crank, their faces serious with concentration. As they walked back to their cabin later, bellies full of vanilla ice cream and hearts full of simple joy, Lucas looked up at the star-filled sky and asked, Can we stay here forever, Mama? The question pierced Elena's heart. We'll stay as long as we can, she promised, knowing better than to offer certainties in a world that had proven repeatedly uncertain. The following Saturday, Elena was surprised when Carson approached as she finished her morning chores. Taking the truck into town for supplies, he said. Thought you and the boys might want to come along, get things you need. The offer was unexpected. In the 3 weeks they'd been at Willow Creek, they hadn't left the property once. Elena had been saving the small salary Carson paid her, knowing they'd eventually need to move on. That would be wonderful, she accepted. The boys would love an outing. The trip to the small town of Sage Creek, 40 miles away, became an unexpected adventure. The twins, who had rarely left city environments before, were fascinated by the small-town atmosphere. The general store where everyone knew Carson by name, the tiny library housed in a converted church, the ice cream parlor that still used metal dishes and real spoons. Mr. Carson, do you know everyone? Miguel asked, as yet another person greeted him familiarly. Small towns have long memories, Carson replied cryptically. Elena noticed how people regarded Carson, with respect, certainly, but also with a careful distance, as if he were a wild animal they admired, but knew better than to approach too closely. Only Mabel, the elderly owner of the general store, treated him with comfortable familiarity. About time you brought your new family around, Mabel declared loudly as they approached the counter with their supplies. Town was starting to think you'd made them up. They work for me, Mabel, Carson corrected, ears reddening slightly. Not my family. Mabel snorted, unimpressed by the distinction. "Those boys need proper shoes," she informed Carson, nodding toward the twins' well-worn sneakers. "Growing children need good footwear." Before either adult could respond, Mabel was leading the delighted twins toward a display of sturdy children's boots. "On the house," she said firmly when Elena tried to protest. "Consider it a welcome to Sage Creek gift." As they loaded their supplies into Carson's truck later, Elena noticed him watching the boys proudly trying out their new boots, stomping experimentally on the sidewalk. "Mabel's always been a soft touch for kids," he explained, but there was something gentle in his expression that belied his casual tone. "She seems to have a soft spot for you, too," Elena observed. Carson's face closed slightly. "She and my mother were friends. Feels responsible for me since Mom passed." It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother directly, and Elena treaded carefully. "When did she die?" 8 years ago. Cancer." The words were clipped, final. "And your father?" 5 years before that. Heart attack in the barn." Carson secured the last of their supplies. "Ready to head back?" Message received. Conversation over. That evening, as the boys played with Lazarus, who had graduated from his temporary coop to following them around the ranch like a feathered guardian, Elena sat on the cabin porch watching the sunset. Carson appeared from the direction of the barn, hesitating briefly before approaching. "Boys enjoying those boots," he observed, nodding toward where Miguel and Lucas were showing Lazarus their new footwear. The rooster tilting his head as if admiring them. "They've never had new boots before," Elena said. It was very kind of Mabel. Carson settled on the porch step below her, his usual position when they talked, close but not too close, as if maintaining a carefully measured distance. "How'd you end up with the rooster?" he asked, changing the subject. Elena smiled at the memory. "The boys found him behind our apartment dumpster in Phoenix. Someone had abandoned him, probably a backyard chicken owner who discovered roosters are illegal in city limits. He was half dead, missing feathers, so that eye already gone." "And you took him in?" Carson said. "Not a question." Elena shrugged. "The boys were adamant, said he deserved a second chance." Carson watched Lazarus, strutting importantly beside the twins. "Seems to think he's their protector now." "He's attacked stray cats that came too close," Elena confirmed with a laugh. "Fearless, despite his size disadvantage." They fell into comfortable silence, watching the boys play in the lingering twilight. Finally, Carson spoke again, his voice different somehow, more hesitant. "You said before you were looking for somewhere quiet, running from something." He glanced at her, eyes serious. "Or someone." Elena tensed. "Why do you ask?" "Need to know if trouble's likely to find its way here," Carson said simply. Elena considered deflecting, changing the subject as Carson had earlier. But something about the quiet evening and his straightforward question made evasion seem wrong. "His name is Robert Keller," she said finally. "He owns a construction company in San Diego. We were together for almost a year. He was charming at first, generous. The boys adored him." Carson waited silently, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "It started small. Criticisms. Checking my phone. Questions about where I'd been, who I'd talked to. Then came the anger. Broken dishes. Holes punched in walls." Elena's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "The first time he hit me, the boys were at school. I told myself it was a one-time thing. That he was under stress. All the excuses women tell themselves. But it wasn't one time," Carson said quietly. Elena shook her head. "The last night, he'd been drinking. Got angry because dinner wasn't what he wanted. The boys tried to defend me and he—" She stopped, the memory still too raw. "He didn't hurt them badly, but the look in his eyes. I knew it was just a matter of time. We left that night with whatever we could carry." "Has he tried to find you?" "He's not their father, has no legal claim, but yes. He's contacted my sister, my old workplace. Says he just wants to talk, to make things right." Elena met Carson's gaze directly. "Men like Robert don't change. They just get better at hiding who they really are until you're trapped again." Carson's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "He knows you're in Arizona?" "I don't think so. We went to New Mexico first, stayed with a cousin, then Tucson with another relative. Phoenix was just a stopping point." Elena's smile was sad. We've gotten good at disappearing. Carson was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and certain. 40 miles is a long way to come looking for someone. He repeated his words from their first night. And if he did, he'd have to get past me. The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Not quite a promise, but something solid she could almost reach out and touch. Thank you, Elena said softly, meaning it. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, Elena found herself unable to rest. Their conversation with Carson had stirred up memories she'd tried to bury. She slipped outside, needing the vast night sky to calm her thoughts. To her surprise, a light still burned in Carson's house. As she watched, his tall figure emerged onto his porch, silhouetted against the warm light behind him. He stood perfectly still for a moment, then descended the steps and began walking toward the barn. Without conscious decision, Elena found herself following, drawn by some instinct she couldn't name. She found him in the horse barn, methodically checking each stall, his movements practiced and efficient. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly from the doorway. Carson turned, unsurprised by her presence. "Rarely do. Not well, anyway." "The war?" Elena guessed, stepping into the barn's comforting darkness. Carson's laugh was humorless. "That's part of it. Mine gets stuck sometimes in places it shouldn't go." Elena understood that better than she wished to. "What helps?" "This," he gestured around the barn. "Routine. Physical work. Exhaustion sometimes." They stood in companionable silence, listening to the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, the distant call of a coyote somewhere in the hills. "Why'd you let us stay?" Elena asked suddenly. "You didn't need the complications we bring." Carson considered the question carefully. "Ranch was too quiet," he said finally. "Been alone too long. Starts to hollow you out after a while." The simple honesty of his answer touched something in Elena. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a victim or a single mother or a woman on the run, but simply as a person trying to rebuild a life from scattered pieces. "The boys are getting attached to this place," she said softly. "To you." Carson's expression showed a flicker of something, concern perhaps, or uncertainty. "That wasn't my intention. I know," Elena assured him, "but they've had so few constants in their lives, so few people who didn't eventually disappear." Carson met her gaze in the dim light of the barn. "Not planning on disappearing," he said simply. "This is my land. My home." The words carried a weight that settled around Elena like a blanket, the rare security of someone rooted so deeply to a place that leaving was inconceivable. "I should get back to the boys," she said after a moment. Carson nodded, turning back to his nightly routine. But as Elena reached the barn door, his voice stopped her. "Elena," he said, her name sounding different somehow in his voice. "That rooster of yours crowed twice that first night. I'm starting to think he might have known something we didn't." The words followed Elena back to the cabin, wrapping around her thoughts as she slipped back into bed beside her sleeping sons. Outside, the desert night hummed with ancient rhythms, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena allowed herself to think beyond tomorrow, beyond next week, to a future that might contain more than just survival. 2 months passed, and Willow Creek Ranch gradually transformed under Elena's influence. The vegetable garden that had been Carson's mother's pride flourished again with her careful tending. The twins had carved out small territories for themselves. Lucas, drawn to the horses, showing a natural affinity that Carson quietly nurtured. Miguel, more interested in the mechanics of ranch life, shadowing Carson as he repaired equipment and maintained the property's infrastructure. And Lazarus, once a half-dead rescue, now ruled the barnyard with pompous authority, his damaged eye and battle scars only adding to his imperious demeanor. Carson, who had initially regarded the rooster with tolerant amusement, now saved scraps for him and occasionally could be spotted having one-sided conversations with the bird when he thought no one was watching. Summer's fierce heat gave way to autumn's gentler warmth, the desert softening under less punishing skies. The evening Carson stepped onto Elena's porch as she sat drinking tea. His expression more serious than usual. She knew immediately something had changed. "Is everything all right?" she asked, setting down her mug. Carson took off his hat, turning it in his hands. a rare gesture of uncertainty from a man usually so contained. "Been thinking," he began. "Boys need schooling." Of all the things Elena had expected him to say, this wasn't among them. "Yes," she agreed cautiously. "I've been saving to move somewhere they can enroll for the spring semester." Carson's hand stilled on his hat. "Sage Creek has a good school. Small. Teacher can give them attention they need." Elena's heart quickened. "Carson, are you suggesting—" "Job here is permanent if you want it," he said, words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out before he reconsidered. "Could drive them to school daily. Or—" he hesitated, then continued more carefully. "Town has a small house for rent. Previous tenant left last month, if you'd prefer to be closer to the school, less isolated." Elena studied his face, trying to understand what wasn't being said. "Are you asking us to leave the ranch?" "No," Carson said quickly, then more firmly. "No, just giving options. Your choice." Relief washed through Elena, followed immediately by realization. This wasn't about the boys' education. Not entirely. This was Carson, in his own careful way, offering them stability, a future beyond temporary shelter. "The boys love it here," she said softly. "They've never been happier." Something eased in Carson's posture. "They're good kids, smart, deserve a chance." "What about the drive to town?" Elena asked practically. "That's a lot of extra work for you." Carson's lips quirked in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Thought maybe you could learn to drive the truck yourself. Ranch needs a second driver anyway." The offer, the trust it implied, left Elena momentarily speechless. When she found her voice, it emerged rough with emotion. "You'd teach me?" "Not much to it," Carson shrugged, but his eyes held something warm. "Just need practice." In that moment, with the desert stretching vast around them and the first stars appearing overhead, Elena felt a shift in the foundation of what had been building between them. No longer merely employer and employee, no longer simply two wounded people maintaining careful distance, but something new and unnamed yet undeniably real. "I'd like that," she said finally, "for the boys to go to school here, for us to stay." Carson nodded once, satisfied, and placed his hat back on his head. As he turned to leave, he paused, glancing back at her. "Told you that first night," he said quietly. That rooster crowed twice. As if on cue, from his perch near the cabin, Lazarus let out a triumphant crow that echoed across the darkening ranch, a sound that now felt less like coincidence and more like prophecy. October painted the desert in subtle shifts of color, the sage more silver than green, the distant mountains sharper against the clearer autumn sky. Elena's first driving lesson in Carson's old pickup had been an exercise in barely controlled terror, for her, not for him. Carson sat in the passenger seat with the same unflappable calm he showed breaking wild horses, offering quiet guidance as she ground the gears and stalled the engine repeatedly on the ranch's back roads. "You're doing fine," he assured her after she nearly took out a fence post. "Nobody learns without making mistakes." By the fifth lesson, Elena could handle the truck with growing confidence. By the 10th, she was driving the twins to their first day at Sage Creek Elementary School, Carson following behind in his newer vehicle just in case, though they both knew it was unnecessary. The school was small, just 68 students across 6 grades, but the building was well maintained, and the teachers welcoming. Principal Judith Barnes, a stern-looking woman with surprisingly kind eyes, took special interest in the twins. "We don't get many new students mid-semester," she explained, kneeling to the boys' level. "Especially not identical twins. You're going to be our celebrities for a while." Miguel and Lucas, normally so outgoing, pressed against Elena's sides, suddenly shy in this new environment. "They'll be in Ms. Holloway's class," Principal Barnes continued, standing. "She's excellent with children who've experienced transitions." The knowing look she gave Elena suggested she understood more than had been said about their situation. "I've prepared their enrollment forms," Elena said, handing over the manila folder Carson had helped her organize. "But I should mention, we don't have their previous school records. We left quickly." Understanding flickered across the principal's face. "We'll do placement testing today." "And Mrs. Vasquez," she added more quietly, "Sage Creek is a tight-knit community. If there's ever any concern about safety, Please let us know immediately. Elena glanced at Carson, who stood slightly apart, his presence supportive, but unobtrusive. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Thank you," Elena said, touched by the woman's perceptiveness. As they prepared to leave the twins in Miss Holloway's capable hands, Lucas suddenly grabbed Carson's calloused fingers. "Will you be here when school's over?" he asked anxiously. Carson looked startled by the physical contact but didn't pull away. "Your mom's picking you up," he said gently. "But I'll be at the ranch when you get home." Lucas considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Promise?" Something shifted in Carson's expression. A softening around the eyes, a momentary vulnerability quickly masked. "Promise," he affirmed. The word weighted with unexpected significance. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, both adults lost in their own thoughts until Carson broke the silence. "Boys settled in all right," he observed. Looked nervous, but not scared. Elena nodded, hands steady on the wheel as they traveled the long stretch of desert highway. "They're resilient. They've had to be." "You did that," Carson said, his gaze on the passing landscape. "Gave them security even when you didn't have it yourself." The unexpected praise warmed Elena more than it should have. "I've made plenty of mistakes," she admitted. "Stayed with Robert too long. Kept us moving when maybe we should have asked for help sooner." "You protected them," Carson countered firmly. "Did what you had to with what you had. No shame in that." They drove in companionable silence for several miles before Carson spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "Barnes seemed to understand your situation without much explanation." Elena sighed, eyes on the road. "She probably sees it more often than we'd like to think. Women and children starting over, running from something." Carson's jaw tightened. "He ever try to use the system against you? Police reports, custody claims?" "He's not their father," Elena reminded him. "No legal standing. But yes, he filed a missing persons report in San Diego, claimed I'd taken property belonging to him. Fortunately, the detective who interviewed my sister recognized the situation for what it was." Carson nodded, absorbing this information with the focus he brought to everything that mattered. "Good to know," he said simply. 2 weeks into the school routine, Elena began to truly believe they might have found their place. The twins thrived in Miss Holloway's classroom, coming home each day bursting with new knowledge and stories about their classmates. Carson had built a study area in a corner of the main barn, a small desk with 2 chairs, shelves for books, a battery-powered lamp for darker afternoons, where the boys could do homework while Elena finished her day's work. More evenings than not, they ate dinner together now, sometimes at the cabin, sometimes at Carson's house. The man who had once seemed so contained, so careful with his words and presence, gradually revealed glimpses of dry humor and unexpected gentleness. He taught the boys to play checkers, showed them how to identify animal tracks, and started reading to them from a worn copy of The Jungle Book that had been his as a child. "You're good with them," Elena observed one evening as they washed dishes side by side in his kitchen, the twins already asleep on his living room sofa after an ambitious hike to see ancient petroglyphs carved in canyon walls. Carson's hands still briefly in the soapy water. "Never thought I would be," he admitted. "Never saw myself with kids." The confession opened a door Elena had been hesitant to approach. "You never wanted children of your own?" Something shuddered in Carson's expression, and Elena immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "Wanted them once," Carson interrupted, his voice low. "Long time ago." He didn't elaborate, and Elena didn't press, but later that night, as she carried a sleeping Miguel to the truck while Carson followed with Lucas, she noticed him pause before settling the boy in his seat, his expression momentarily unguarded as he looked at the sleeping child. The following week brought the first real chill of autumn. Elena woke before dawn to find frost silvering the desert around their cabin, the cold seeping through poorly sealed windows. She wrapped herself in an extra sweater before heading out to start the morning chores, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Carson was already in the barn, examining the roof with a frown. Need to patch that before winter sets in properly, he said by way of greeting. Noticed your cabin windows aren't sealing well either. Elena rubbed her hands together for warmth. We'll manage. I can stuff towels around the worst spots. Carson's frown deepened. Not good enough with the boys. Desert nights get below freezing come December. He seemed to debate something internally before continuing. Main house has 3 empty bedrooms. Makes more sense for you to move in there for the winter. The suggestion caught Elena completely off guard. Carson, we couldn't impose. Not imposition if I'm offering, he cut in. Practical solution. House is better insulated. Has proper heating. More space for the boys. People will talk, Elena said, immediately regretting the words. What did it matter what people thought? But Carson didn't dismiss her concern. They already talk, he said simply. Mabel from the store asked last week when the wedding was. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold morning. That's ridiculous. We're not. I know that, Carson assured her quickly. Told her same thing. But small towns make up stories whether you give them reason to or not. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, the offer stands. Separate rooms, separate lives if that's what you want. Just seems foolish to let the boys freeze when there's warm space going unused. Put that way, it was hard to argue with his logic. Still, Elena hesitated, aware that crossing this threshold, literally and figuratively, would shift something fundamental between them. Let me think about it, she said finally. Carson nodded, already turning back to the roof problem. Fair enough. That afternoon, as Elena checked the fence line along the northern boundary of the ranch, dark clouds began gathering over the distant mountains. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the wind picked up, carrying the unmistakable scent of coming rain, a rarity in this part of Arizona, especially an autumn downpour. She hurried to finish her work, concerned about getting back to meet the boys' school bus. As she mounted her horse to return to the main buildings, the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a drenching shower that soaked through her jacket in minutes. By the time she reached the barn, the rain had become a deluge. Elena dismounted, leading her horse into the shelter where Carson was already moving hay bales away from a leaking section of roof. Storm blew in faster than expected, he shouted over the drumming of rain on the metal roof. Road to town might flood if this keeps up. Alarm shot through Elena. The boys. Already called the school, Carson assured her. Bus is turning back, keeping all the kids there until it's safe. Barnes says they'll be fine. Got emergency supplies, we'll make it an adventure for them. Relief washed through Elena, followed by profound gratitude. Of course, Carson had thought of the twins' safety first. They worked side by side, securing the animals and protecting vulnerable equipment from the increasingly violent storm. Water began pouring through multiple sections of the old roof, and the wind howled through gaps in the barn's wooden walls. Need to get to the house, Carson shouted as a particularly strong gust rattled the entire structure. This building isn't safe in a storm this size. They made a dash for the main house, rain lashing at them like tiny whips, the 100-yard distance seeming to stretch endlessly. By the time they stumbled through Carson's front door, they were both drenched to the skin and shivering. Power's out, Carson observed, moving efficiently through the darkening house. He lit several kerosene lamps, their warm glow creating islands of light in the gathering gloom. Need to get dry. I'll find you something to wear. Elena stood dripping on the entryway rug, suddenly aware of how intimate the situation had become. She was alone with Carson in his home, soaked and vulnerable, while her children were miles away in town. Carson returned with a stack of clothing. Bathrooms down the hall. These will be too big, but they're dry. I'll make coffee. The simple normalcy of his actions calmed her racing thoughts. This was Carson, the man who had given her family safety, who had proven his character 100 times over. There was nothing to fear here. The clothes, a faded flannel shirt and sweatpants with a drawstring waist, engulfed her small frame, but they were warm and smelled faintly of cedar and something uniquely Carson. When she emerged from the bathroom, he had changed as well and was stoking a fire in the large river rock fireplace that dominated the living room. Phone lines are down, he reported, straightening. But the school has generators and emergency protocols. Boys will be fine until morning if necessary, Elena nodded, fighting against the maternal instinct to panic at being separated from her children. Thank you for thinking of them first. Carson looked almost surprised. Course I did, he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He handed her a mug of coffee laced with something stronger that spread warmth through her chest. They settled before the fire, listening to the storm rage outside, an unexpected pocket of peace in the midst of nature's fury. When I was a boy, Carson said unexpectedly, my father would tell stories during storms like this. Said the thunder was the desert gods arguing about where to send the precious rain. Elena smiled at the image. My father said storms were the sky clearing its throat before singing the rain song. Carson's lips quirked. Poetic. He was, Elena agreed softly, a dreamer. Impractical about most things except horses. My mother was the practical one, keeping the books, making sure bills got paid. They still alive? Your parents? Carson asked. Elena shook her head. Car accident when I was 20. Black ice on a mountain road. The memory still ached, but time had dulled its sharpest edges. I was in college then. Came home, tried to keep the farm going, but without them. She shrugged. Had to sell it eventually. That's how you ended up in San Diego? Followed a friend there. Got work as an exercise rider at a racing stable, then assistant manager at a riding school. Elena took a sip of her spiked coffee. That's where I met Robert. He brought his niece for lessons. Charming, successful businessman who seemed impressed by my knowledge of horses. Carson's expression darkened at the mention of Robert, but he kept his voice neutral. And the boy's father? The firefighter. That was before, Elena explained. Daniel was a good man, just not meant to be tied down. We were never really together, just a brief connection that resulted in unexpected consequences. She smiled, thinking of her sons. The best consequences, as it turned out. Carson studied her over the rim of his mug. You've handled a lot on your own. Not always well, Elena admitted, but you do what you have to for your children. Mama Bear, Carson observed, something like admiration in his voice. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across the room as the storm continued its assault outside. In this cocoon of warmth and unexpected intimacy, Elena found herself wanting to know more about the man who had become so important to her family's life. Your parents, she ventured. You said your mother loved this place. Carson's gaze turned to the fire. It was her family's land originally. Warrens had ranched here for 3 generations before she married my father. He took a long drink from his mug. She was the heart of this place. After she died, it just existed. Survived. Didn't really live. Like its owner, Elena said softly. Carson's eyes met hers, startled by her perception. Maybe, he acknowledged after a moment. Came back from my last tour different. Harder to connect with people. Then Dad died, and Mom got sick, and afterward, he shrugged. Easier to be alone than to try explaining myself to people who couldn't understand. And now? Elena asked, the question hanging between them like a fragile thing that might shatter if handled roughly. Before Carson could answer, the radio on the kitchen counter crackled to life, an emergency broadcast system updating on the storm. They both rose, moving to listen to the staticky report of flash flooding, road closures, and the recommendation that all residents remain sheltered in place until morning. School is listed as an emergency shelter, Carson noted with relief. Boys will be fine there tonight. The knowledge that her children were safe allowed Elena to release the tension she'd been holding. Still, the thought of spending the night without them, knowing they might be frightened, made her heart ache. Hey, Carson said gently, reading her expression. Lily and Lucas are tough kids. They'll see this as an adventure. I know, Elena sighed. It's just, we haven't been apart overnight since they were born. Carson hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. A rare initiation of physical contact from him. "We'll try to reach them on the radio once the worst passes. Let them know you're okay, too." The simple understanding in his voice loosened something in Elena's chest. Without thinking, she leaned into his solid presence, her head resting briefly against his shoulder. Carson froze for an instant, then his arm came around her in an awkward but genuine embrace. They stood like that for a heartbeat, two people who had learned to be self-sufficient, finding unexpected comfort in connection. Then, as if by mutual agreement, they separated, the moment acknowledged but not remarked upon. "Should check the generator," Carson said, his voice slightly rougher than normal. "Make sure it's fueled for the night." As he donned a raincoat and headed out into the storm, Elena found herself standing in his kitchen, surrounded by evidence of the life he'd built here. The handmade cabinets his father had crafted, the collection of smooth river stones his mother had gathered, the military commendations tucked half-hidden on a high shelf. A life with deep roots but pruned branches, a life that had made space for 3 unexpected visitors with their own burdens and hopes. When Carson returned, soaked again despite the raincoat, they fell into a comfortable routine of preparing a simple dinner from the supplies in his well-stocked pantry. The domesticity of chopping vegetables side by side, of setting his table for 2 instead of 1, felt both strange and surprisingly right. Later, as the storm finally began to abate, Carson managed to reach the school on his emergency radio. The crackling connection carried Ms. Holloway's cheerful voice, assuring them that the twins were fine, currently engaged in a flashlight shadow puppet contest with the other stranded children, more excited than frightened by the unexpected adventure. "Mama?" Miguel's voice came through next, slightly distorted but unmistakable. "Are you and Mr. Carson okay? Did Lazarus get scared of the thunder?" The normalcy of his concern made Elena laugh, despite the tears of relief pricking her eyes. "We're fine, sweetheart. Lazarus is in his coop, probably sleeping through the whole thing. Are you and Lucas being good for Miss Holloway?" "Yes, she let us help make peanut butter sandwiches for everyone. We're having a big sleepover in the gym." Lucas's voice chimed in. "There's another boy with a twin too, but they're not identical like us. When are you coming to get us?" "As soon as the roads are safe," Carson answered, leaning toward the radio. "Probably tomorrow morning. Listen to your teachers and get some sleep if you can." "Okay, Mr. Carson." Both boys chorused, and something in their easy acceptance of his authority, their trust in his word, made Elena's heart constrict with emotion. After signing off, Carson turned to find Elena wiping away a stray tear. "They're really okay," she said, half to herself. "They sounded so normal." "Told you they were resilient," Carson reminded her, "like their mother." The simple compliment, delivered without embellishment, warmed her more than the fire or the borrowed clothes or the spiked coffee had managed to do. That night, as Elena settled into the guest room Carson had prepared for her, a space that somehow managed to be both impersonal and welcoming, she found herself thinking about the conversation they'd left unfinished. "And now?" she had asked him. Now that he wasn't alone anymore, now that his quiet ranch had been invaded by twins and a one-eyed rooster and a woman with a complicated past. Sleep claimed her before she could follow the thought to its conclusion, but her dreams were peaceful despite the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Morning broke clear and brilliant, the storm having washed the desert clean. Elena woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Carson's voice speaking quietly to someone. For a disoriented moment, she thought the twins had somehow made it home, but when she entered the kitchen, she found Carson on his radio again, getting updates on road conditions. "Highways still flooded in sections," he reported, setting down the handset. "But there's a back route through the hills. Old Ranch Road. Can take us to town once it's light enough to navigate safely." They ate a quick breakfast, both eager to reach the school and retrieve the twins. Elena had changed back into her own clothes, now dry after hanging by the fire overnight, but she'd kept Carson's thick socks, her boots still soaked through. As they prepared to leave, Carson hesitated at the door. "Been thinking about what you said, about moving into the main house for winter." Elena looked up, surprised he was raising the subject now. "Makes sense," he continued, not quite meeting her eyes. "Practical solution, like I said. But—" He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Want you to know there's no expectations that come with it. No complications." Understanding dawned. He was trying, in his own careful way, to reassure her that offering shelter didn't mean he expected anything in return, a consideration that spoke volumes about his character and his understanding of her past. "I know that," Elena said softly. "I never thought otherwise." Carson nodded once, satisfied. "Good." He opened the door, letting in the fresh, rain-washed morning air. "Should get going if we want to reach the boys before lunch." The journey to town via Carson's alternate route took them through parts of the desert Elena had never seen, hidden canyons where improbable greenery flourished, ancient rock formations, carved by millennia of wind and rare water, vistas that stretched to the very curve of the earth. Carson navigated the rough terrain with confidence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local history. "Grandfather claimed there was a lost gold mine in that canyon," he said, nodding toward a particularly dramatic rock formation. "Spent 20 years looking for it. Never found a thing except a few arrowheads and a lot of rattlesnakes." They arrived at the school to find the twins engaged in helping clean up the gymnasium where they'd spent the night. The boys spotted them immediately, abandoning their tasks to race across the room. "Mama! Mr. Carson!" they shouted in unison, colliding with the adults in a tangle of small limbs and excited voices. Elena knelt to embrace them properly, checking them over with a mother's thoroughness despite knowing they were unharmed. "Were you scared?" she asked, smoothing Miguel's tousled hair. "A little at first," Lucas admitted. "But then Ms. Holloway made it fun. And Principal Barnes told us we were having an adventure we'd remember forever." "Did the barn flood?" Miguel asked Carson earnestly. "Is Lazarus okay? What about Ember and the other horses?" Carson knelt to the boy's level, answering his questions with the same seriousness he would give an adult. "Barn's fine, just a few leaks we'll fix. Animals are all safe. That old rooster of yours was strutting around this morning like he personally chased the storm away." The image made both boys giggle, and Elena was struck by how natural Carson looked, crouched beside Miguel, his usual reserve softened in the face of childish concern. As they prepared to leave, Principal Barnes approached with Ms. Holloway. "Your boys were absolute troopers," the teacher assured Elena. "Helped with the younger children, shared their snacks, even led some games when energy was running high." "You've raised remarkable young men," Principal Barnes added, her gaze including Carson in the compliment. A subtle assumption that made Elena glance quickly at him, but his expression revealed nothing beyond polite acknowledgement. The drive home was filled with the twins' excited chatter about their night at school, the improvised dinner, the flashlight games, the ghost stories an older student had told before teachers intervened. Elena watched them in the rearview mirror, marveling at their resilience, their ability to transform potential trauma into positive memories. When they arrived back at the ranch, the evidence of the storm's fury was everywhere. Branches down, a section of fence collapsed, the garden partially flooded. But the building stood solid, and as they pulled up to the cabin, Lazarus came strutting importantly to greet them, crowing his welcome as if personally responsible for their safe return. "Guess we know who's really in charge around here," Carson observed dryly as the rooster inspected the truck with proprietary interest. The twins tumbled out, eager to check on their feathered friend and see the storm's aftermath for themselves. As Elena moved to follow, Carson's hand on her arm stopped her. "About the house," he said quietly. "Think about it. Offer stands." Elena looked at him. This man who had become, against all odds and expectations, a cornerstone of their new life. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes held something warmer, something that spoke of more than practical considerations. "I will," she promised, and knew as she said it that the decision had already been made, not from necessity or convenience, but from the recognition that sometimes safety came in unexpected forms, and home wasn't always where you planned to find it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.